Hexis is often translated as habit, and while this translation is not wrong in itself, it is somewhat incomplete, because a habit is something a person repeats, while hexis is the settled condition a person comes to possess through what has been repeatedly done. And this distinction actually matters because Aristotle is not mainly interested in routines, techniques, or some external patterns of behavior. Aristotle is more so interested in the formation of character. He wants to understand how repeated action becomes a condition of the soul, and how that condition then shapes what a person sees, what a person enjoys, refuses, chooses, and actually does in his life. Now, our modern conception of habits usually points towards behaviors, repeated behaviors, right? So when we think about habits these days, we tend to think about waking up at a certain hour, training at a certain time, reading every single morning for an hour or two, ideally, avoiding certain pleasures or keeping certain rules and repeating a habit until it becomes easier. And none of this is wrong, of course. Even Aristotle gives repetition a central place in our moral formation. But repetition alone is not the center of the whole argument, because repetition itself is only the process, while hexis is what the whole process actually leaves behind. Which is why Aristotle's familiar claim about how our actions shape who we become, this must be handled carefully. It is true that we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and courageous by doing courageous acts. But this is of course not a mechanical formula. It does not mean that any repeated action automatically becomes virtue simply because it has been repeated often enough, right? And as we've talked about in the previous videos, repetition can form a person in more than one direction. A person who repeatedly gives in when confronted with fear doesn't become courageous. They become disposed toward cowardice. And a person who repeatedly gives themselves over to pleasure doesn't become free in relation to pleasure. Instead, they become disposed toward intemperance. And a person who repeatedly acts for the sake of praise, this person doesn't automatically become magnanimous. They become dependent on being praised by other people. So the question here is not whether a person has habits in the ordinary sense. Everyone has habits. Everyone has repeated patterns that have begun to shape who they are. The actual question here is what those repeated actions have made stable. So Aristotle's concern is not about repetition as such, but the condition repetition actually produces. The same process that can train courage can also train cowardice. The same process that can form restraint can also turn into indulgence. And the same process that can make noble action more natural can also make base action easier to perform and also easier to justify rationally. So this is the first thing hexis forces us to see. A person does not simply remain untouched by what they repeatedly do, and our actions don't simply pass over the surface of life and then disappear completely. Actions shape the person who acts. It makes certain things easier and certain other things harder. It gives certain pleasures more authority in our lives and makes other pleasures less available. And it can also make some refusals feel almost natural, while others will start to feel like an interruption of our desires. And over time, what a person repeatedly does begins to settle into what that person is or who he is becoming. Which is why Aristotle's account of moral education is more demanding than just a simple doctrine of self-control or self-discipline. Self-control can restrain an appetite or an reaction, or it can force an outwardly courageous act, but moral formation aims at something else. Moral formation aims at the condition in which the person does not merely force themselves toward the better act every single time. It actually aims at a formed state at which the more noble act can begin to flow naturally from our character. So the courageous person in this case may still feel the fear, and the temperate person may still recognize pleasure, and the generous person may still understand the value of money. But fear, pleasure, and money, these will no longer govern them in the same way, because these desires now meet a character that has actually been formed to stand against them properly. So, in other words, hexis is not a habit as some sort of visible routine. It is also not simply something that happens often enough that it becomes automatic. Hexis is a formed condition of the person. It is the state in which repeated action has actually become their character. Now, in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle asks what kind of thing virtue actually is. And here he narrows it down to 3 possibilities. According to Aristotle, there are 3 things that are found or can be found in the soul. And these things are passions, capacities, and states. And this isn't just a technical aside. Aristotle is actually trying to locate virtue within the structure of the soul. Because if virtue is going to explain the quality of a person's character, then it cannot simply be enough to say that a person sometimes feels fear, anger, desire, confidence, pleasure, or pain, since these are all passions. In other words, passions are movements that arise in us, affect us, and pull us toward or away from any given action. And they matter deeply for virtue because courage concerns fear, temperance concerns pleasure, good temper concerns anger, and generosity, of course, concerns the use of money. But the passion itself is not yet the virtue. So the decisive question here is not simply what a person feels, but how the person has actually been formed to stand in relation to what is being felt here. Which means that virtue itself cannot be a passion. We are not praised or blamed simply for experiencing anger, fear, desire, or pleasure. A person is not unjust merely because anger appears. A person is not courageous merely because fear is present. And a person is not temperate merely because pleasure exists before them as something that is maybe pleasant. The actual moral question here concerns how the person actually stands in relation to these things. It concerns whether they are actually feeling the right things at the right time, toward the right object, in the right way, for the right reason, and to the right degree. So passion is actually what has to be ordered, while virtue is the state by which that ordering becomes possible. Anger can be expressive, it can be deficient, or it can be proper. Fear can be obeyed too quickly, ignored too foolishly, or faced in the right way. Desire can pull the soul out of measure, or it can be held in the right relation to what is actually good. In each of these cases, the passion is not the virtue. The virtue is the formed condition that actually allows the passion to be present or experienced rightly or expressed rightly. Now, after establishing that passion is not virtue, Aristotle then turns to capacities. And here, a capacity is understood as the ability to experience these passions in the first place. We all have the capacity for fear, the capacity for anger, the capacity for pleasure, and the capacity for desire. But according to Aristotle, virtue cannot be a capacity either, because capacities are given by nature. They belong to us before our character has been formed. A child can feel fear, an animal can show anger, and anyone with a normal human constitution can experience pleasure or pain. So none of these capacities can tell us whether the person is excellent or defective in relation to them, since a capacity only tells us that something can happen in us. It doesn't really tell us what condition we are in when it actually happens. It also doesn't tell us whether fear will govern us, whether anger will be proportioned or not, or whether pleasure will rule us, whether honor will be rightly valued, or whether pain will be endured for the sake of something higher. In other words, capacity only provides the material out of which character can be formed, but it is itself not yet character. And courage makes the distinction crystal clear here. Fear, for example, is the passion, and the capacity for fear belongs to us by nature. But cowardice, courage, and recklessness are not just natural capacities. They are different states of character in relation to fear and confidence. The cowardly person is not defective simply because they have the ability to feel fear. The reckless person is not excellent simply because fear is somewhat diminished or absent, and the courageous person is not simply someone in whom fear has actually disappeared. To the contrary, the courageous person has been formed in such a way that fear and confidence are ordered toward what is actually honorable. They stand firm when standing firm is actually called for, not because passion has now completely vanished, but because passion no longer governs their actions. And this is precisely why Aristotle says that virtue is a hexis. Hexis is a formed condition of character. It is stable enough to make a person recognizable across different situations, but it is also not static, finished, or inert, because a person's hexis is not hidden behind life as some private interior possession. Our hexis expresses itself in action. It becomes visible in what is chosen, in what is refused, in what is endured, in what is pursued, and in what gives us pleasure and what causes us shame. And it is reinforced by action, but it also can be weakened by action, which also means that hexis is not automatically good. Virtue is a hexis, yes, but vice is also a hexis. Excellence is a formed condition, but corruption is also a formed condition. The intemperate person is not simply someone who happens to choose pleasure a bit too often. The intemperate person is actually the kind of person to whom pleasure appears more authoritative than it should. The cowardly person is not simply someone who once failed in the face of fear. They have actually become disposed to give fear more importance or weight than it should have. And the vain person is not merely someone who enjoys praise uncontrollably. They have actually become the kind of person for whom being seen or being praised has become a condition of self-regard. In other words, hexis doesn't yet tell us whether the formation has actually produced virtue or vice. It only tells us that a person has now acquired a settled condition, and whether that condition is excellent or defective depends a lot on what it actually disposes the person toward, and how it actually orders their actions, passions, pleasure, pain, and the appearance of the good. This is why Aristotle's definition of virtue is very exact. According to him, virtue is a hexis concerned with choice, lying in a mean, relative to us, determined by reason, and done so in the way that the practically wise person would determine it. Our earlier video on Aristotle dealt with excellence as something that is made real through activity. The video on Mesotis dealt with the structure of the mean and why virtue is actually not moderation in the ordinary sense. The video on Phronesis dealt with the practical wisdom that sees what a concrete situation actually calls for. But here, with hexis, we are dealing with the formed condition that actually allows all those ideas to become stable in a person. In other words, virtue is not just the passing emotion. It is not the raw capacity to feel that emotion, and it is also not the isolated act taken on its own. Virtue is the settled condition from which excellence can actually proceed. Without hexis, arete will remain only an ideal of excellence. Mesotes will only remain a structure, and phronesis will remain only as an account of judgment. Hexis is the condition in the person through which this excellence, this measure, and this judgment actually become our character. So once virtue has now been correctly understood as hexis, then the remaining question is what this condition actually changes. And Aristotle's answer is not simply that hexis changes behavior. What actually changes, according to him, is the whole field from which action proceeds. Hexis changes our relation to pleasure and pain. It changes what appears worth choosing. It changes how a situation is actually perceived. And because of this, it also changes the way action belongs to the person who acts. And here, pleasure and pain are central because they reveal the actual condition of our character. A person may perform the outwardly correct act, but the pleasure or pain that accompanies this act tells us something about the state from which the act is being done. Think about it, the temperate person and the self-controlled person both may refuse a disordered pleasure, but they do not refuse it from the same condition. The self-controlled person still feels the pull of what is being refused here, and he refuses it anyway because he's self-controlled. While the temperate person has been formed differently fundamentally. The temperate person, he does not need to overpower his desire in the same way, because desire itself has already been brought into better or proper order. Which is why virtue is not yet complete when the external act is correct. The action must actually come from the right state of character. In other words, the virtuous person takes pleasure in what is honorable and actually feels pain at what is base. They do not have to persuade themselves each and every time that nobility is preferable to degradation. For the virtuous person, it just appears that way because their character has actually been formed that way. And the same is also true for choice. Aristotle says that a virtuous act must be chosen knowingly, chosen for itself, and chosen from a firm and stable state. A person can do the just thing by accident, or from fear of punishment, or for the sake of good reputation, or because someone else has, let's say, instructed them, or just because circumstances leave them no other option. In each of these cases, the external action may be correct, yes, but the source of the action has not yet settled, which means that for the act to actually reveal virtue in the fullest sense, it has to proceed from the person as an expression of their actual character. Which also explains why vice is so serious for Aristotle. To him, vice is not merely weakness, ignorance, or a sequence of isolated failures. Vice is formation in the complete wrong direction. Since one's character has been badly formed, the problem is not only that the person chooses wrongly after seeing clearly. In this case, the problem is also that the seeing itself has been corrupted, which means that what appears worth choosing has already been shaped by what the person has become. Which means that for an incorrectly formed person, the lesser thing begins to look sufficient. The easier thing begins to look reasonable. The merely pleasant begins to look worthy of pursuit. And the shameful thing usually also loses some of its shamefulness because the character that should actually recoil from it has already been weakened and deformed. Which is exactly why two people can stand before the same situation and not actually see the same thing or react the same way. One will see an opportunity for honorable action, while the other may just only see inconvenience. One will see an insult to be endured for the sake of something bigger than themselves, while the other sees only a wound to their pride. One will see the pleasures that should be refused, while the other will just see a chance to satisfy the desire. In other words, the visible facts, they may be the same, but the character receiving them and acting from that character, the actions that flow from that character, that won't be the same. And in these situations, hexis is the condition beneath the difference. It is not merely that one person has better information. It is that one person has been formed in such a way that the right features of the situation actually become visible under the right aspect. The honorable appears as honorable. The base appears as base. The excessive appears as excessive. The deficient appears as deficient. And because the situation is seen under the right aspect, action can begin from the right place. So the correctly formed person doesn't just do the right thing magically. The formed person still has to deliberate. Phronesis is still needed, because no rule can actually remove the difficulty of action in any concrete situation. But deliberation now takes place within a character, or it flows from a character that has already been trained. The right orientation does not have to be created from scratch each and every time, because it is already present. And because it is already present, action can flow naturally from it. So for Aristotle, character is not hidden behind action. Character is actually formed through action and revealed again in action. What a person repeatedly does settles into what that person is, and what that person is determines what they can see, what they can enjoy, and what they can become. Ultimately, without hexis, virtue remains intermittent, but with hexis, the person becomes ordered enough for excellence to actually proceed from their character itself.